Good evening, everybody. My name is Berit Ebert. I'm the Vice President of Programs here at the Academy in Berlin, and I welcome everyone to this Inga Maren auto lecture, Idiom, Unifying and Integrating Compositional and Improvisational Language as a Composer Performer by Anna Weber, a New York-based composer, flutist, and saxophonist who is our Spring 2021 Inga Maren Otto Fellow. And as you can all see from the name, this fellowship has kindly be, or is being supported by Inga Maren Otto, and we're very grateful for the support. We're also very grateful, and it's truly wonderful that Anna is here with us at the Academy. We only wish that we could see and hear a bit more of her, especially if we have a composer here at the Academy and under the current circumstances can't really hear all of her wonderful things. This is actually quite sad, but so it's even more rewarding to have this lecture tonight, and where I know that we also have some performative aspects. Anna will be talking about her work, and afterwards we'll be in conversation with Ingrid Laubrock, and Ingrid will also moderate the question and answer session after Anna's talk. You're all kindly invited to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Just type in your questions and Ingrid will read them. The raise your hand function will not be activated, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Ingrid, who is a Brooklyn-based German jazz saxophonist, and she primarily plays tenor saxophone, but also performs and records on soprano, alto, and baritone saxophones. Ingrid's main projects as a leader are Anti-House, Sleep Thief, Ingrid Laubrock Septet, and Yuba Tuba. Collaborations include the Paradoxical Frog, the Ingrid Laubrock and Tom Rainey duo, as well as the projects with Stephen Crump and Corey Smith. In 1998, she has released her first solo album, Who Is It? And countless albums followed. I will not name each of them, that would be too long. I think your last one, Ingrid, was Dreamt Twice, Twice Dreamt, which was a very personal one inspired by your dreams. And I can highly recommend that everyone in the audience goes online on Ingrid's page and just buys one and then listens to it. So following this great music, there was only one logical step coming next in Ingrid's career. And this were, of course, as you've heard, countless albums followed by countless awards. Among them, the BBC Jazz Award for Innovation in 2004. But I especially would like to mention the Rising Star Tenor Saxophone Award in 2018, as this was probably the wisest award, dear Ingrid, that you have ever received, because it clearly had a future-telling capacity. You now are a star. So congratulations. And this is totally being proven by your composition Vogelfrei for orchestra, soloists, and choir from the album Contemporary Chaos Practices, which was included in the New York Times 25 Best Classical Music Tracks of 2018 by New York Times critic Seth Coulter-Walls. And if you in the audience think that Ingrid stopped there, well, you're totally wrong. She has continued or done some side work. She has taught improvisation workshops at Townsend University, Cal Arts, University of San Diego, UC Irvine, Baruch College, and at the University of Michigan, the University of Newcastle, and many, many others. So having said all that, there is only one conclusion about Ingrid to draw here, and this is this woman can simply do everything. And one thing that she will have to do now in this overall universal everything capacity is introduce Anna. Thank you, Ingrid, for being here with us. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Barrett. That was ample and an amazing introduction. This brings me to the part that is more nerve-wracking to me than playing saxophone or composing music, which is public speaking. But I'm feeling extremely honored and happy to introduce my friend and colleague Anna Weber, who's an amazing, extraordinary, forward-thinking musician and composer. Does great personal research. I think we probably met around 2010 or 11, shortly after we both moved here. This is New York, where I'm speaking from. And I've been following her work and admiring her work for many years now. I find her one of the most interesting voices here, and the most and someone who follows, who is, I think, interested in a similar things that I'm interested in, which is creatively combining improvisation and composition and making both personal. So Anna Weber is a flutist, saxophonist, and composer whose interests and work live in the aesthetic overlap between avant-garde jazz and new classical music. She has released several recordings as a band leader, including 2019's Clockwise, which was called Visionary and Captivating by the Wall Street Journal, and was voted the #6 best album of 2019 by the NPR Jazz Critics Poll. Clockwise featured a septet comprised of several of the most creative musicians working in New York's avant-garde, and was released on Pi Recordings. Pi Recordings is a small but incredibly active independent label here, which I also recommend to anybody who wants to check out new and sort of current music on this scene. In addition, Anna's 2020 release, Both Are True, with the Weber Morris Big Band, that she co-leads with saxophonist and composer Angela Morris, also a great tenor player here, was named the top 10 best release of 2020 by the New York Times. Anna also leads the critically acclaimed Simple Trio with drummer John Hollenbeck and pianist Matt Mitchell. They have released 2 albums on Skr Record, Binary in 2016 and Simple in 2014. In addition to being a 2021 Berlin Prize Fellow, Anna was also a 2018 Guggenheim Fellow. She was voted top rising star flutist in Downbeat magazine Critics Poll in 2020. She has additionally been awarded grants from the Shifting Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec, and the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as residencies from Exploring the Metropolis, the MacDowell Colony, the Millay Colony for the Arts, and the Brush Creek Foundation for the Arts. Anna is originally from British Columbia and studied music at McGill University in Montreal before moving to New York in 2008. She holds master's degrees from both Manhattan School of Music and the Jazz Institute Berlin. So I look forward to hearing Anna's lecture and to get a bit more insight into her compositional process, and I hope you enjoy it. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Ingrid. And yeah, just a little background. Ingrid is a huge hero of mine and somebody whose music I've enjoyed listening to and learned from listening to for a long time. And it's an incredible honor to have you here with me to do this discussion and influence me. Also, big thanks to Inga, Mar, and Otto for making my fellowship possible. Um, and huge thanks to all the staff at the American Academy Berlin who have made this fellowship actually happen despite everything going on in the world. And it's really a pleasure to be here in Berlin right now. And thank you to everybody who's here listening. Thank you for showing up to this. So before I get started, a couple of notes. I just want to say that there's a huge range of expertise of people in the audience, both musicians and composers, and also people who are from outside my field. So I'm trying to keep this talk to some sort of middle ground where everyone can get something out of it. So apologies for maybe not going into too much detail on some things. And also, I would highly recommend to use headphones or good speakers if at all possible, because I'll be playing a lot of music. So the title of my lecture is Idiom, Unifying and Integrating Compositional and Improvisational Language as a Composer-Performer. So what does that mean? I situate myself in the music world as a composer-performer, meaning I both write and play music, but namely that I write music for myself to play. This is nothing remarkable in the jazz world. Most of the greatest jazz composers were also its best instrumental practitioners. However, it's interesting to consider that in the history of Western classical music, at least, the composer is often behind a veil, quite separate from the musicians who perform their works. So, with that in mind, it's been my long held opinion that jazz composer performers are in a unique and privileged position. We have the opportunity to create the perfect vessels for ourselves as improvisers. Both the composition and the improvisation, which fits the composition, comes from the same mind, and we can compose shapes for ourselves that perfectly encompass our priorities and desires as improvisers. So a couple of years ago, I noticed that there was a rift between the way that I played and the way that I composed. As a player, I was interested in extended techniques or the saxophone as a creator of sound and not just pitch. But my compositional world was more concerned with cool rhythms, melodies, harmonies, the standard tuning system of Western classical music that we call equal temperament. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but as someone who believes that there should be a continuum between my compositional and improvisational language, a goal in the past couple of years has been to try to bring these syntaxes closer together. One attempt to remedy that for myself has been a series of pieces that I've been writing called Idiom. I'm using the word idiom here in the sense of characteristic mode of expression or language rather than aphorism. And I've been thinking about how that term can be applied to my music. So I'm thinking about the word idiom in two ways. First, what is language to an instrument? And I think maybe an obvious answer is the language of music, but I'm actually thinking of something almost more elemental than that, something more unique to the character of the instrument. Instruments don't naturally just play beautiful melodies that are perfectly in tune. Trained musicians work for years to coax these out of their instruments. And there are other ways of playing most instruments and other sounds that are possible. Extended techniques is a broad term, meaning any non-traditional way of producing sound on an instrument. We use the term extended techniques, but it's actually something of a misnomer, labeling such sounds as abnormal when in fact they are the result of the instrument behaving how it is naturally inclined to behave. These take a lot of practice to control too, just like playing beautiful melodies in tune, but there's sort of a naturalistic glory to them that I really love, and they distinguish one instrument from the next in a really special way. In some cases, these sounds are more idiomatic to the instruments than the learned manipulations that allow musicians to tame their instruments into playing in equal temperament. So I wanted to demonstrate a few extended techniques that are possible on the saxophone. So the first is slap tongue, which is you essentially form a vacuum between the reed and the mouthpiece, and it sounds like this. And then you can make air sounds by using the instrument as an amplifier and blowing wind through the instrument. There's flutter tongue, where you trill your tongue like this, and then you play a normal note. And you can just click the keys and the instrument amplifies them. And there's multiphonics, where you sort of more or less fool the instrument into playing two notes or more at once. So the second way that I'm thinking about the word idiom and language is in terms of what language is to me as an improviser. Every improviser has a language of their own that they've developed, a syntax, a normal way, even if it's just normal for them, that various sounds connect and are used. As for my own language, I should just mention that none of my language was created in a vacuum, and I'm indebted to so many people that within the scope of this lecture, it doesn't even really make sense to start mentioning names. But there are many, many improvisers and composers, as well as teachers and mentors whose creativity and language have contributed to the development of my own, both directly and indirectly. So while I hope that my language is at this point personal, my language is also essentially my influences filtered through my personality and my experiences and the place in history that is my vantage point. With the Idiom series, I was trying to find the place where my idiomatic improvisational language intersects with the idiomatic language of my instruments, namely the saxophone and the flute. Each of the idiom pieces focuses on a specific woodwind extended technique, which I took from my own improvisational language. I wanted to use the physicality of my instruments as the foundation for these works and to orchestrate outward from that point. There are currently 6 idiom pieces. The first one I originally wrote for duo and then reorchestrated for trio. The second one is for a septet. 3, 4, and 5 are for trio, and 6 is for a large ensemble with 12 musicians. Most of the music is on a record that is about to come out, which is called Idiom, It's coming out on May 28th of this year on Pi Recordings that Ingrid mentioned earlier. It's a double disc set where the first disc is my trio and the second disc is the large ensemble. However, the piece I want to play first actually came out a couple of years ago on a record called Clockwise in 2019. So the piece from this record that I want to talk about is Idiom 2, which deals with what I call ventings on the saxophone, which is where you hold a key open on the instrument while moving your other fingers normally. So I have some audio examples for you. So the first is me playing normal notes. It goes D, C, B, A, C, A, D, A flat, and so on. And then in the next two examples, I will hold a key down and then play those exact same notes, and you'll see how this creates a quirky microtonality. So that's holding down a side D key, and then here's holding down a side C key. This is a technique that I've used a lot while improvising, and I've worked out a bunch of different fingering combinations exploring the natural microtonality of the saxophone. So when I wrote this piece, Idiom 2, I improvised my way into it. I recorded myself improvising with this particular idea, and then I transcribed what I'd played, and then expanded on it, and figured out what else I could do. So you'll hear this piece open up with this idea, up pretty high, played by by two tenor saxophones. Later, you'll hear it come back in a couple of different ways, once in a lower register, and then another time at a different tempo. So keep your ears open for that. So I'm going to play for you a little bit of an edit of this piece, Idiom 2. This is a performance from last year's Jazz Fest Berlin. Ironically, I am in Berlin now, but this performance was actually done in Brooklyn at a venue called Roulette, and it was live streamed to the Berlin audience. This was last November, and this was the first concert that I had played of my music since the beginning of the pandemic, so since March, and it was an incredibly special concert that I won't soon forget. It felt really good to be playing music with my friends again. And for those of you who are interested, you can actually still stream the whole thing at Arte Concert. So this is Idiom 2. So next I want to play one of the idiom pieces that I wrote for my trio, the Simple Trio. Simple Trio has been my main working band since 2013, and this upcoming album, Idiom, will be our third. It features John Hollenbeck on drums and Matt Mitchell on piano. A little Berlin connection is that John used to be professor at the Jazz Institute Berlin, which is part of the UDK, which is where I met him while I was doing a master's degree a decade ago. And this photo of the trio was taken in Berlin. We recorded our second album, Binary, after a European tour in 2016 at Studio P4, which is located in the old GDR Rundfunkhaus. And this is a photo that was taken along the banks of the Spree River right by there. So Idiom 4 works with a series of multiphonics that I call beating multiphonics. Beating multiphonics are not quite, but almost an octave, which makes them feel super unstable, and you can hear them sort of fighting against themselves and pulsing or beating. And I'm going to play a few of these right now. Now, if you're really paying attention or you have perfect pitch, that what I play in the video doesn't line up exactly in the order that I have these multiphonics written here, but you'll get an idea of what they sound like. So Idiom 4 takes these beating multiphonics and creates an invented mode from all of the notes within these multiphonics. And then I worked with this mode to create a unison line between the piano and the saxophone. And then I used several different types of other extended saxophone techniques like air sounds, slap tongues, singing, to create more complex unisons in the blend between the saxophone and piano and the drum set. So we're going to hear this piece from the middle. You'll hear the saxophone and piano playing some of these multiphonics together. The score doesn't start there. And then you'll hear us play this unison line here together. And then after that, I improvise over the form a couple of times before improvising more freely and then ending with the beating multiphonics. The largest scale work from the Idiom series is Idiom 6, which is an hour long and scored for a 12-piece large ensemble plus conductor. You can see the large ensemble here on your screen. And this work is the whole second disc of Idiom. The instrumentation is conceptually 4 groups of 3 woodwinds, 3 brass, 3 strings, and 3 rhythm section, plus conductor. And the specific extended technique that I used as a foundation for this work is a series of dyad multiphonics that can be found on a tenor saxophone, all of which form small intervals, so minor seconds to slightly large major thirds. There's a set of these that occur in the low range of the instrument and a set of these that occur in the high range. These multiphonics manifest both literally and abstractly throughout the piece in a number of different contexts. And here's a few examples of them, starting with a couple of low multiphonics. And then some high ones. So I want to take a little bit of a closer look at Idiom 6 Movement 2. So Idiom 6 Movement 2 deals with, or it's written based on a bass line that I wrote by generating the difference tones of some of these multiphonics, octave transposed. So a difference tone is a note that our ear creates psychoacoustically, which means it's only in our ears, it's not actually being generated by whatever is playing the note. So it's created psychoacoustically when the vibration bands of 2 frequencies are very close together. And the tone you hear is quite simply the difference in frequency between those 2 notes. So as an example here, I have a high G, which is 1,568 hertz, which is vibrations per second, and then a high A, which is 1,760 hertz. So if you subtract 1568 from 1760, you get 192, which gives you a slightly flat G below middle C. So I'm going to just play these for you so that you can hear. The first is the G, played on a flute. Now it's the A. And now I'm going to play them together. So you might not notice it at first, but you probably will hear a buzzing in your ears. You might experience it as just kind of like something that feels a little bit closer to you than the source of the sound. I'm going to play that once more just so you can have a second chance to kind of listen for it. But basically, just keep in mind that the only 2 notes that are happening are the high G and the high A. And if you're hearing a lower note, it's actually just being created by your ear. So all that is to say is that I measured the frequencies of the 2 notes that were produced by these multiphonics that I was using, and then I figured out what the difference tones would be. These are all a little bit hypothetical, as some of the difference tones were very low to hear. So I octave transposed them into a register that would work. So even though they're hypothetical, the idea is that they're still acoustically connected to the material that I was working with. And then I used those difference tones to create a bass line. And this became the bass line that you'll hear right off the bat in this piece. It also became the canon that you'll hear right after that, and then later stacked harmony in the last section of the piece, which we won't have time to listen to right now. This treatment of extended techniques is in this case fairly abstracted, more so than in the other examples that I showed you. I actually don't even use tenor saxophone in this piece, even though I used tenor saxophone to play the dyads originally. The other thing that I was playing with in this movement was rhythmic pushing and pulling, or expanding and contracting. In the bass line you'll hear at the beginning, you'll hear the same figure repeated, but at slightly different tempi. And then you'll hear sort of a brass canon, which also has various tempi, some written, some improvised, and those are happening all at once, culminating in a timbral improvisation. To me, this is also a bit of abstracted work with these dyad multiphonics. Any 2 frequencies can be seen as ratios of each other. So in the example I have on the screen right now, you could have that be seen as a ratio of 1568 to 1760, and you could obviously simplify that because neither of those are prime numbers. So many of these relationships between frequencies are very complex, but the ones that our ears are drawn to tend to be very simple ratios. So 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 5 to 4, 6 to 5, 3 to 2, 4 to 3. A lot of these dyad multiphonics fall into these ratio categories, or very close by, because they're coming from the natural overtone series of the saxophone. So I started with these simple ratios to come up with the rhythmic relationships in this piece. 6 to 5 can be a ratio of frequencies, but it can also be 6 beats in the space of 5 beats. All of the pushing and pulling in this piece is because of the ratio relationships between the pulses, which are in turn related to the frequency relationships between the notes of the dyad multiphonics. So this is Idiom 6, movement 2. So that was movement 2 from Idiom 6. Um, so just to close, I just want to say that given the specific language that I use for all the pieces in the idiom series comes from my improvisatory wheelhouse, it feels doubly idiomatic, tailored both to my improvisatory language and also to the language of the instruments themselves, and it feels very personal. The exploration of my own idiomatic language and that of my instruments has made me feel like I've brought my compositional practice to another level and that I've come closer to finding the center of my musical personality. And I hope that that has come through in this lecture and that you've enjoyed listening. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to the upcoming discussion.
I was drawn into the music that I didn't realize I have these horrible headphones on. Um, well, first of all, thank you so much for the amazing dismantling of what you do, but also the great music. I'm really, it's beautiful to listen to, and it's, to me personally, it's just so satisfying to hear how much you, the original thought that you put into all of this, but also how much material you get out of very little, and how you can draw it out and keep making it interesting and keep like shaping it into something that's coherent, and where you but you never, you feel always I felt the whole time captivated by it and interested by it, rhythmically speaking, super cool. um, I will open this to questions. Anybody can ask any questions. But I was wondering, just because I don't know if the people who are here at this lecture know those musicians, if you could maybe just mention who the musicians are in the last ensemble, and also why you picked them as a whole.
Yeah, so it is myself. I played flute on that piece. Yuma Usaka plays on that piece contralto clarinet, but he also plays clarinet and tenor saxophone on the recording. Nathaniel Morgan, who also mixed the record endlessly with me on on alto saxophone. Um, Trumpet is Adam O'Farrell. Jacob Garchick plays trombone. David Bird Marrow plays horn. Um, Strings, Erica Dicker plays violin. Joanna Matry plays viola. And Mariel Roberts plays cello. And then the rhythm section is Liz Kozak, who lives in Berlin, actually, on synthesizer. And Nick Dunstan on bass, who actually also just moved to Berlin. And Satoshi Takeshi. And yeah, I picked those musicians. Well, I knew I wanted to do a group that was a large ensemble that was, I guess, the traditional thing that jazz composers do and that I have also done in the past is to do a big band. But I wanted to do something that was a little bit closer to a new music large ensemble, kind of one of each instrument sort of thing. And I also had all these people that I had in the new music world had met and hadn't had a chance to collaborate with, a lot of whom are really, really great improvisers as well. That's like a skill set that a lot of new music performers have now, and improvise in a really interesting way because they're not coming from the same background that we are as jazz players. They have a lot of different reference points and touchstones, and I find that really interesting. And then I also wanted to work with a lot of jazz musicians. I actually on purpose chose this group based on people that I hadn't really had a chance to collaborate closely with, coming from the jazz world. And yeah, that was how that band came about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's like very interesting how the we have so many shared sound worlds with as improvisers with the new music world, and it's been a really exciting. I mean, it's not as if the musicians from those two fields and various fields haven't collaborated before, but now it seems to like be approaching each other more closely, and there seems to be a real like a willingness to learn from each other a lot, which is great. It's gotten to a
Totally.
super interesting level, I think, here for sure, but also in other countries, as you know, in Europe for sure, as far as I can see or hear from the music that I'm hearing
Mhm.
from there. And how much did you talk to the musicians about your underlying compositional concept for this? Did you talk to them at all, or would you rather? Are you more interested in them figuring out their own language over this and their own. I mean,
Yeah,
rhythmically, you must
I
have heard
don't
it.
think I really talked to almost any of them at all about it. That being said, especially the woodwind players, we talked a lot about multiphonics because I, at various points, make them also play multiphonics, and so that meant, teaching them the fingerings that I have for these, like the low multiphonics and the high multiphonics, and getting those together. Um, and I did like work with everybody one on one as I was writing this piece to really start developing like the global language that I was going to be using for it. Um, but yeah, I mean, I feel like my preference as a player in other people's bands is usually like, if I'm interested after I've learned the music, then that's cool if I can learn how it was written. But it can sometimes be a hurdle to have a bunch of like conceptual information thrown at you right when you're learning a piece. So I usually sort of just prefer to just see something on paper and then like, oh right, okay, that's how it works together. So I think as a composer I sort of have a similar attitude. Like, I don't need to tell anybody anything. If I've done my job, then it should all just be there. And then if I need to explain something a little bit in more detail, then I can go into that later.
Yes, I'm totally with you on that one. No, it's just there's also like as an improviser, you wanted a certain sense of mystery and discovery,
Yeah,
and
and I feel like it
having
helps
not,
people to play different stuff
yes.
than I would have thought of if I
Mhm.
don't tell them necessarily what the underpinning is.
For sure. We we have some questions here, so should I just
Sure.
look into them? Here's someone with respect to difference tones. How do you account for everything else that's going on? Difference tones tend to work best when they are played in isolation, so I wonder how you envision the listener hearing them.
Yeah, well, as I said, the ones that I was using for this piece were totally hypothetical. Um, if I wanted the listener to hear them, which that's completely correct, like they are kind of they're like a secondary um effect of two notes. Like you sort of don't necessarily notice it unless if you're listening for it. So if I were to use them where I really wanted to draw out a difference tone, I would definitely have to orchestrate in a different way than what I did here. But here I wasn't actually generating difference tones. I was just using the multiphonics as a way of having something that um, created something secondary that was then used by me in order to make a cool bass line. So it really, it's just more hypothetical than expecting a listener to hear a difference tone. But in some places in the piece, there are difference tones that I think are pretty clear, not in the stuff that I played. There's a section where it's all like the saxophone's just playing all these high multiphonics together. But my goal is not necessarily to create a melody out of those different tones at that point. It's just to have the effect of that happening.
Hmm. So in this case, you were using the difference tones that you studied in isolation to create the melodic material for the bass line and for the.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the piece, you don't have to hear them as different tones to understand, to appreciate the piece of music.
Hmm. And the next question, I'll just read it out as they
Sure.
see them. I loved the trio idiom piece performance. It was so nice. Could you talk more about how you approach improvising in this context, in this piece in particular? More generally, it is clear how you're connecting composition to your improvisation. But how did you arrive to your improvisation language?
Um, well, I guess there's the question of how I arrived to my improvisation language uh, in general, which is maybe a bigger question than to answer here. But I guess like in terms of approaching the improv with this piece, as sort of touched on, I created a mode that I wrote the, the unison line between the sax and the piano with, and so I was starting with that because those sounds, those notes make sense. But I feel like there's also kind of a rhythmic mode with that piece. It's not just a scalar mode, but also like the grid that happens, and for me that's um, almost more important to be rhythmically strong as an improviser when playing over something like this. So, working on just like how can I incorporate fragments of this into my improvisation? How can I play like freely over this rhythmic structure and but still like be able to hit things here and there that show that it's connected to what's happening.
Yeah.
Um, and with the band in general, I think I told them to like start by playing under me exactly what's written and then slowly get away from that. And so by the second time that I'm improvising over it, I think they're being pretty loose with the material. But there's a few like really important touchstones within that form. There's like the um, kind of big multiphonic like half note quarter note that happens like dun, dun. So that's something everybody can kind of jump onto. And then there's just the language of the piece itself, like 16th notes, groups of five. So after we've sort of done away with the actual grid, just like using the language that is um, in the piece as just like yeah, like a rhythmic mode that we can all refer to, I think is how I approached it.
Hmm. I felt it was like yeah, the quintuplet was a big like thing you could like my ear could like focus on,
Yeah,
and also and similar in the large piece. I mean, I think I don't have the score in front of me, but like the last half note you have or dotted half note you have that brings it back to the top.
yeah,
It's nice to have these little fail safes and also these little musical cues
totally.
that can bring you back.
Yeah, something if you get derailed, you can all just agree on one thing,
Totally.
like
And
a
also
cadence.
yeah, it is a cadence, a
Mm.
rhythmic cadence, and I felt also that the vamp in the trio piece, it was just long enough for you to not figure it out as a listener before it started changing.
Yeah,
So there's and I think that is kind of important when you try and um, uh, mold or meld free improvisation and written music, because it can be very abrupt unless you want it super abrupt and here's a vamp and now we're going into something free, which is a choice.
yeah,
um, this is a nice way of like gradually moving one into the other and kind of corrupting the music as you go along, I guess.
yeah. That's something that I find it's always really interesting to figure out how to do that in a way that's smooth. Because yeah, obviously you can just make a hard line between the written stuff or the improvised stuff, and that's a sound that totally works. But yeah, it actually takes kind of a lot of practice, I think, to get something to like sound smooth as it decomposes rather than like you know jarring.
Yeah, and the right musicians.
Yeah, totally.
For sure. I don't see any other questions, so we can just keep talking, I guess. Oh, there's one. Here, how do you find agreement if everyone does not know the rules? I think you mentioned there are no rules to a degree, except what you wrote into the chart in terms of there's a fixed rhythm or there's a fixed.
Yeah, I mean, and
Oh,
the rules are that I guess, or the agreement comes from just the fact that that band has worked together for a very long time, and they are excellent at playing this kind of music, and there's sort of a set of rules that I think everybody who plays this kind of music at a high level uh, knows about and will follow, um, and but also just like a common language and knowing each other and knowing like okay, well, when they do this probably means this. When they do that, I, I I'm pretty sure they're about to do this thing. So just from the long relationship of playing with the group.
right.
Yeah.
I also noticed that like I mean you make your trio sound very large, larger than a trio, which is great. And you have like somebody like John Hollenbeck, who's a fantastic orchestrator.
Yeah.
Who brings his own instrument orchestration to the whole piece, and yeah, it was very beautiful. There is another question here. The rhythm aspect seems to be very important and very complex in your pieces. How is your relationship with rhythm, and how do you work on it, or how did you work on it?
Yeah, well, I guess as somebody coming from the jazz world, rhythm is super important. For me, it's the thing that I've worked probably the hardest at. And I think the thing that for me, you know, I've worked harder at than other things because I think for me, maybe when I was younger, it was like a weaker thing. So I really wanted to be strong with rhythm. I just find it endlessly fascinating. There's so many. You can go so deep with even just like a very small, simple amount of material. You can really get so much out of it, and and then yeah, it just I really enjoy also the connection between pitch and rhythm, and how to make those two things connected in a way like I did here with the sort of the ratios of dyads being related to rhythm of like, or the actual rhythm and polyrhythmic stuff, but also just like creating some sort of, okay, well, if I have this pitch set and the notes are, you know, X, Y, and Z, how can I make that into a rhythm? How can I take that and transform it and have everything be connected that way? um but yeah, I mean, I think ultimately like my obsession with rhythm really just comes from like playing a kind of music where I play with drummers a lot, and I love playing with drummers. I love groove. I love you know, rhythmic games and stuff like that. And so, yeah, that's very important to me.
It is also really something that was very neglected in a Western middle class kind of upbringing. I mean, I don't know your background, but
Yeah.
I know like in my German small town that wasn't particularly addressed. So I was pretty shocked when I started playing jazz and other music and realized that I know nothing.
Yeah,
About
totally. Totally.
Here's a question. Following up, how did you co-develop these shared languages as a group? When someone does this, it indicates that we do that. Do you see the question as well?
Oh
Right?
yeah, I'm not looking at it. Uh yeah, I guess I don't know that we ever talked about it. I think it's really just like a, after playing with somebody a long time and noticing somebody's uh own language, habitual cadences, uh not just individually but also just, you know, in the language of jazz, for example, like there's rhythmic cadences that come up that, like, you know, Max Roach did a thing, and therefore like if somebody else references that, you know what probably is going to happen next. It's like the language of the music. And while this is like fairly abstracted from traditional jazz, a lot of that still exists. There's a language within a community. There's a language of types of things that people are naturally going to play when they intend to like say, okay, I'm going to play this, and then you'll know that like the downbeat is coming up, or this is the top of the form. Um, and then there's also just like individual languages that it's again not something that we discussed as a group necessarily, but something that like I played with my trio for almost a decade now. I've played with them individually for, I guess, slightly longer than that, and you really get to know somebody's personality from playing a lot of gigs, and you also get to know like what they are likely to do in certain situations.
Yeah, that brings us a little bit back to the introduction that you gave. Like, as jazz musicians or jazz performers, we have the incredible luxury of touring and play. Like, I mean,
Normally.
not vaguely remember it, but it I've done it.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so we have actually a thing of, or the possibility to develop almost an intuitive language with each other if we know each other well, right? Like, um, there's a certain amount of phrasing or yeah, like for example rhythmic phrasing. Or every swing drummer will have a different time feel on the right, or every drummer will have a slightly different 16th note feel. Everything is grows together and becomes rhythmically much more coherent if you play with somebody for a long time. And I mean, there are musical cues that drummers will give you to show you where, to show uh, where we. I mean, there are.
To help us horn players out a little bit.
Yeah. Although I must admire, I'm a big admirer of your cues.
Oh, thank you.
You give the best. I have a lot to learn. Um, yeah, but there is it is a luxury that we have the possibility as both as a composer to amend our compositions in real time over the course of touring,
Yes.
and we have the ability to grow together and kind of develop a language that is very particular to a group, and really unique to a group. And I think there are now new music groups that work in a similar way, which is also fantastic. They develop this super amazing interaction and compose for each other, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
There are now quite a few questions,
Yeah.
so
I see that.
um, The idea of idiom is here very instrumental, physical, and personal. To what extent is the unconscious consequence of a local or shared tendency an accent, if not a complete language? I didn't read that well. To what extent is the unconscious consequence of a local or shared tendency an accent, if not a complete language? To what
So
extent?
like the language that maybe a like the group of improvisers in New York City shares, as opposed to the group of improvisers in London or wherever else shares. Maybe that's the accent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. To what extent does idiom depend on being unspoken?
I mean, I guess in the context of my pieces, I was thinking about it really as not even a community language so much as just like my language that I play when I'm improvising.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think the interesting thing for that for me as like kind of studying my own habits and figuring out what I do was that once you've written something down or maybe like spoken it out loud as the question talks about, is that it's harder to then use that in an improvised context, which I think is awesome to to sort of like once you codify it, then like can you actually then you have to push yourself farther as an improviser when you're getting into those improvised zones, because you can't just use that as like a little trick that you do. So I
Yeah.
think that there's actually something really interesting about like speaking it out loud, and then it becomes something that you have to like develop into past the place that you had originally. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how
I think so. I think it also ties in with the next one, which is my understanding is that you view improvisation composition as a separate, as mutually exclusive activities that you're trying to bring together in your music. I grew up in an oral tradition in which the two are mutual imbricated. I don't know what that means. Could that be implicated or imbricated? Hence the use of the phrase performance composition to describe African music. Could you speak about composition, about how composition influences or enables your improvisation?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like the trying to bring those two practices close together was sort of a realization that the way that jazz is taught in schools and jazz composition is taught in schools is like a weird taking of like this, radical American art form and putting it into these like easily digestible boxes. And it's like, this is how you play over this chord, this is how you play over this chord, this is how you play over this chord. And then, you know, to further separate composition from that practice. So I do feel like the bringing it closer together is really for me not like something that is groundbreaking or like anything new at all. It's really just like recognizing that that is the way that improvisation and composition have existed together, since the beginning of music, since the beginning of improvised music, and that it's really just like this basically taking taking jazz out of clubs and putting it into schools that has created something that's a little bit yeah, more sterile. um but yeah, I mean, I think like how composition influences or enables my improvisation, just yeah, just in the way that I was talking about, like once I do then write something down, and it helps me to develop more of a language around that thing that I was doing improvisationally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. Like jazz in schools tend to be a certain period tends to be taught,
Yeah.
and where at the time the people who were playing this music and who were at the forefront of it were like visionary and totally groundbreaking and always renewing themselves, etc. And right now it's sort of just a small part of jazz that's being taught, and so I
Yeah.
also find that very important that you find your own voice within that, because the rest has been done to great satisfaction, right?
Yeah.
And like somebody like John Coltrane already messed it up for all tenor players for the rest of our lives by being so incredibly searching and amazing and mind blowing on the instrument. That I also feel personally there has to be something that I can contribute that is more myself or more based on personal research. And this to me extends to uh, extended techniques.
Mhm.
Like you can do the kind of cookie cutter thing and get a book and just,
Yeah.
ah, this is good, this is good. But I always, for example, encourage students to just like pick up the saxophone and play the lowest note, play the pure note, which is the low B flat when all the tone notes are covered, and this is the most metal is vibrating, and then experiment. What happens if I open this? What happens if I change my larynx? What happens if I change a little bit of my embouchure? Just to figure out what is your personal use of this, and same with ornamentations. We like, if you grew up playing classical music, like in my case, it was all spelled out for you. So
Mhm.
we, but yet there's so much color in that, like singers know,
Mhm.
vibrato, in all those aspects that make music more personal.
Yeah,
But
totally. I
for
totally
me,
agree about the extended technique thing. I think that the like books of multiphonics kind of ruin it. Like for me, the joy is like, okay, well, I found this thing that works. Like, what else around it also works, and that is like helps to create something that feels way more personal and uniquely yours, rather than just like reading a list of sounds that are possible to make.
totally, yeah, and it becomes. I mean, also then everybody picks the same multiphonics, and it becomes no standard again.
Yeah.
Um, the person who just asked the question corrected me, and imbricated means connected.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Thank you. um, uh, Hi Anna, do you think it's possible to influence listeners on how they may hear music beyond the basics? And do you think this has evolved over time? Thinking about the general population of music listeners.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, I mean, I think partially the music listeners overall who choose to listen to my music or your music or the music of this the person who asked the question that's becoming a much more specific group of people who do have very good ears, who want to listen hard for these sorts of things. Um, so I guess I've never really considered how to like influence listeners beyond the basics, because I assume that most of the people who find my music um, are already trying to hear something that's a little bit more than just what's there. Um, but I do feel like in the last few years, maybe especially connected with like the sort of connection between the new music world and the jazz world, that there's been more of a interest in like scores and how is this notated? How did you think about it? In a different way than, I mean, than I remember from earlier. Not that my memory goes back that long, but I do feel like maybe that has changed over time, and partially it's connected with like that sort of cross collaboration between our world and the new music world. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Um, I think it's easier in cities than
Yeah.
anywhere else. We have. I mean, if I really think about it, like we have a pool of. It's a city of, I don't know, 10 million people or whatever,
Mhm.
and our scene is still relatively small within that. But it doesn't seem that way because everybody gravitates to these cities. Like it's similar in Berlin, or where you have a really vibrant scene and a scene that is curious about each other's music. And so I am always in doubt about that, whether this is like I feel like that and it's misleading because I'm in a city, or whether
Mhm.
that is really true. I do think that like in answer to the person's question, that it is really important to play all sorts of music to children,
Mm.
not just the music that makes them bounce, or that
Yeah.
because I
Totally.
remember personally hearing free jazz on the radio as a child, like as a 9, 10-year-old person, and it's scratchy kind of European noise music, and really liking it. But I also liked Peter and the Wolf and some children's songs, So I think it's important to just to not be patronizing and just expose children to all sorts of music.
Yeah.
That will
Totally.
help.
Yeah.
I see Berit appear.
Yes, I guess we're about to wrap up.
You see me appear. This is the sign for the closing words. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Anna, for a very personal and at the same time super accessible presentation. That was really fascinating. Thank you, Ingrid, for the moderation and the introduction. You're warmly invited to come to Berlin as soon as you can. And for everyone else, our next lecture will be Gate of Tears, Migration and Immobility Across the Red Sea by our fellow Natalie Poitz. And usually this lecture would have taken place in Stuttgart in collaboration with the Deutsch-Amerikanisches Zentrum Stuttgart and the Hospitalhof. This time it will be online, and I hope to see you all on Monday with our hearts in Stuttgart. So thank you both, and have a good evening, day, wherever you are. Thanks. Bye-bye.